Hi all, this is the last video in this section. We're going to talk about ethical relativism and ethical subjectivism and why our textbook makes a big deal out of rejecting them right off the bat. Um, so again, he's talking about objections to doing moral philosophy, right? Reasons why somebody might think that this is like a waste of time to study. Ethical relativism is the idea that our moral claims are grounded in our cultures, right? So if I say something like, abortions are morally permissible. What I'm saying from an ethical relativist standpoint is I am a member of a culture in which majority of us are okay with people sometimes having abortions, right? We don't have a moral problem collectively with people having abortions. Um, or if I say, murder is wrong, what I mean is my culture collectively believes that we shouldn't kill each other, right? That's the idea. Contrast that with something called ethical subjectivism. The ethical subjectivist believes that morality is relative to the individual. So when I say something like abortion is wrong, I'm not saying something like my cultural group collectively agrees that abortions are bad. What I'm saying is I, Dan, have the opinion that abortion is wrong. Full stop. So why is abortion wrong? If you're a relativist, the wrongness of abortion is that most of the people in my culture think it's wrong. They just feel that. And there's no other reason. And that's the important part, right? If you're an ethical relativist, what makes something wrong or right is that the culture group thinks it's right or wrong. End of story. The wrongness of abortion is not some fact about abortions or people or fetuses. It's the culture collectively feels something is the case. And you might see a problem there right away. And with subjectivism, what makes something right or wrong is, again, the individual has this opinion. The wrongness of abortion, if abortion is wrong, for the subjectivist, is that I, the person, feel that this is wrong. Full stop. And that's what a relativist and a subjectivist believe. Now, your textbook says one of the reasons that this view is so popular is because in North America, and this is true, right, both in Canada and the US, we teach the fact opinion distinction to kids from grade K through 12. And your textbook worries, look, that's a really dangerous simplification that leads people to collectively endorse these views, relativism and subjectivism, which are extremely controversial positions morally. And we're going to talk about why that's the case. So, what they teach in K-12, right? My daughter's getting taught this right now in her elementary school, is that there's a distinction between factual statements and opinion statements, right? And so a fact is something that's true or false. And then they usually refer to the sciences and they say it can be verified by empirical observation. It's problematic. We won't get into that. But so they say, okay, so facts, that's what they are. Facts are things that are true or false and they're observable, they're verifiable by observation, right? So right away, something like 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's on this account, not a fact, right? Because you can't observe 2 plus 2 equaling 4. That's true on some other grounds, not based upon observation, right? That's true in the virtue of definition, understanding what twos are, what pluses are, what equals are, and what's for, right? If you understand the language of arithmetic, you understand that the sentence 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true, right? And the truth of that sentence is grounded in the rules and principles of how arithmetic works, not in some observation of the world. But that's beside the point. I'm making this overly complicated. So, teaching little kids in like grade 2, facts, things that are true on the basis of observation, right? If you can observe it, then you have some sort of data that backs up your claim. It's a fact. It can be true or false. Opinions, they say, are the way you feel about things. These are not true or false. These are just these are subjective statements. Opinions are not the types of things we talk about as true. Opinions are the way you feel about the world. They are subjective to an individual. And then they give them lots of examples. I like ice cream. Barbie's a great movie, anything that, right? And then they'll say things like, now value statements. We should be kind to one another. We should not be mean. We shouldn't tell lies. And they say, well, what are these? Well, they're not facts. So they must be opinions, right? And then you build up from there, right? And that's where your textbook has a big concern, is because we've been teaching this, and most of you were probably taught this in school too, right? That ethical statements are opinion statements. Any normative claim, any value statement is an opinion, and opinions are relative to some sort of cultural framework or relative to your subjective opinions. They're not the kind of things that can be true or false. So why is that a problem? Well, again, what that's leading you to do is, if you really think about morality that way, right? And you say morality is just a matter of opinion, it's either your cultural opinion or it's your personal opinion, and there's nothing more we can say to the story. You're adopting what's a really controversial position historically in moral philosophy, and it's not one that at least most philosophers that work in moral theory feel is well backed up by argument. So think about it. If you're an ethical relativist, right? And again, we're talking about simple relativism, right? We're talking about the type they teach in grade schools and the kind of naive relativism that's, students come to a business ethics course or an intro ethics course. Moral statements are true on the basis of a culture believing them, right? So when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Why? Because, well, that's where you get your moral foundations, right? So whatever the majority of Canadians believe about ethics is just true about morality within the Canadian context. And it's true solely on the basis that most people believe it, right? So what we get to, and what's sort of problematic here, is the truth maker for a moral statement becomes collective assent. I'm going to just jump ahead for a second because this is the key claim I want to get to. Right? Normally, like in more, think about when you talk with your friends, right? When you're talking about whatever ethical issue, right? Whether or not men or women should have the same rights. I think that's a good issue, because that's an ethical issue, right? Whether or not we should treat men and women and people of other genders as having the same moral status in our culture. Are we all roughly equal in how we ought to be treated? If excuse me, if you're an ethical relativist, the way you answer that question is by looking at what the culture believes. That would be the truth maker for the moral sentence, right? Whatever the collective whatever the majority of people in the collective believe about the status of men and women and anyone in between is how you should morally feel about the moral status of men and women. If you're a member of a culture like Canada, right, where the vast majority of people feel that men and women are roughly equal, both under the law and in sort of moral and social practice, well, the correct thing to believe is that men and women are roughly equal, full stop, right? Or they are equal. Why? Most of us believe that, full stop. There's nothing else to the story, right? Why? Because you're an ethical relativist. The thing that makes people equal is that most of us believe that. That might seem weird. If you think about a conversation you might have with a friend and you're talking about, well, should we treat men and women as equals, right? You're not going to say, well, most people believe this. And your friend's not going to go, oh, you're right. I used to sort of disagree, but now that you point out that about 51% of the population thinks that's true, you've changed my mind. I agree with you now. Men and women are equal. That's not the way that conversation would ever go, right? What you would do is you would talk about, well, what makes somebody a person? What gives somebody moral status and what gives somebody legal status, right? And then you would say, look, men and women are the same kinds of things under the law, right? And they're the same kind of things when it comes to morality. They have the same capacities, right? They have the same intrinsic worth and dignity. And so we should think of them as being equal morally, right? And historically, that's what debates about the status of men and women have been about, right? And when we talk about things like children or non-human animals or aliens or robots, right? We're not talking about what do most people believe. We're talking about what are the kinds of capacities you need to be a moral agent? Are you rational? Do you have are you conscious? Is there something it's like to be you? Do you suffer? Are you free? Can you govern your actions by the moral law? These kinds of considerations, we think, at least in practice, are relevant to whether or not we treat people as equals. But the relativist has to say that's irrelevant, right? Those are just sort of post hoc justifications you give for the important thing, which is most of the people in your culture believe this. And that's the only relevant thing. See, well, if that's correct, then you've undermined moral discourse, period, right? And you're not capturing the way humans think about morality. What tends to be important to us are reasons for what we believe, not the fact that most of us believe it. So it gets the truth makers for moral claims wrong, right? Going back to my math example, right? We teach fact opinion distinction. Mathematical claims not verifiable by observation. They're true on some other grounds. They're not matters of opinion, right? They're not just sort of how we feel about the world. Mathematical statements are true just in virtue of the general principles and language of mathematics, right? If you understand how all those things operate together, you understand certain claims about math are true and others are false, right? And it's that logical framework that makes the claims true. It's the language entails certain things, right? You might think the same kind of things about morality. What is a person? Person has the following kinds of properties. Men have those properties, women have those properties, children have those properties, perhaps a lot of non-human animals have those properties. Those are the kinds of things that have moral status, right? That's how we typically debate and think about morality. That's radically different than the kind of conversation you have if relativism or subjectivism is true, right? Again, the only thing that matters if relativism is true is how many people in the culture believe it. That's what makes it true. If subjectivism is true, then anything goes. It's really just a matter of opinion, however you feel. You have your truth, I have my truth, never the two shall intertwain, right? So challenge text says is this undermines moral discussion and this gets morality wrong and it's dismissive of morality. It's not embracing, morals in general. And so it's a view we should reject, at least a simplistic version. A lot of people come to ethical relativism because they think it leads to tolerance, right? Look, I have my truth, you have your truth, and they're different and there's nothing more we can say about them. So we ought to be respectful of one another. We ought to be more tolerant than we are, right? Your text points out that's a mistake. If you're an ethical relativist, you don't have any grounds to justify tolerance. You have just as much reason to be intolerant as you would to be tolerant, right? In fact, you might, in some cases, have pretty strong reasons to be intolerant if ethical relativism is true. So think about it. If ethical relativism is true, what makes a moral statement correct is that most people in your culture believe it, full stop. So now look at things that a lot of us want to do today is be critical of something like the colonialist tradition, right? Look at anti-colonialism. Anti-colonialists will say things like, look, our colonial past is something we should be ashamed of. There's a lot of dark things that have happened. We made lots of mistakes and we ought to apologize. At minimum, maybe engage in reconciliation or more, right? To right these wrongs of history. But if you're an ethical relativist, that doesn't make much sense to say at all, right? From the perspective of an ethical relativist, what makes a moral claim true or false is what the collective believes, right? So if you look at sort of our colonial past, well, all these activities that, Canadians engaged in, that, the British Empire engaged in, that, they were largely assented to by the populations at the time, right? And so they would have been correct, right? From the standpoint of the people that were colonialists, what they were doing was even noble in some cases, right? They believed they were doing wonderful things, or at least justified things, right? They thought they were saving the heathens, right? That's a very common kind of argument you got. Or people would say things like, well, you're trying to improve the lives of Indigenous people, right, by stealing their children and doing horrible things, which is nonsense, right, and just objectively wrong and false in practice. But the people at the time thought they were doing good, right? There's no way to say, well, they were mistaken if you're an ethical relativist, because collectively they thought they were doing the right thing, right? They thought what they did was justified. And it was justified because most of them believed it from the standpoint of an ethical relativist, right? But that's not how we talk about morality. We look back at these things and we say, look, people did horrible things, and they, at a minimum, should be morally held accountable for those, right? We want to be able to say that, cultures that engage in oppression or exploitation are doing something wrong, right? We don't want to say, well, they were morally justified simply because most of them felt they were. We want to say they made a deep moral error, and they need to be held accountable for that. But the relativist has to say, look, well, most of the people believe this. Therefore, given that what a culture believes is true about morality, what they did was right. It was obligatory, perhaps. And anybody that disagrees is simply misinformed about the morals of colonial nations. And that's the end of the story. Nothing else to say. So don't criticize them. You don't have any grounds to critique these groups. That makes no sense. That really doesn't capture our moral language, right? The fact that a culture believes something doesn't make it true, right? It means that we might disagree, we might have different beliefs, but disagreement's boring, right? What's interesting is, well, what are the arguments in support of a position, and are they correct? Should we have been colonialists? Should we have been exploiting and oppressing people? Well, no, of course not, right? We can say that pretty easily because we're not sort of committed to the idea that morality is a matter of collective assent. You lose that ground if you're an ethical relativist, right? Directly related to this, there seems to be a big difference between moral principles and moral customs, and ethical relativists and ethical subjectivists, at least of the simple variety that we're talking about in this class, typically get accused of failing to make that distinction. The practices of a culture are customs, right? The things we do are mores, there are customs. But there's a difference between that and then like a general moral principle. So there's lots of cases in which people say, treat their dead radically differently, right? Some people burn their dead, some people bury their dead, some people do other things with their dead. You might, if you come from two radically different cultures, one where you bury your dead and that's how you show respect, and then you're looking at a culture where they don't do that at all, they just burn the dead and then scatter the ashes, you might think, hey, these people are so disrespectful. They're failing to honor the dead, right? They burn their bodies and then they throw the ashes out. That's a horrible way to live. It's immoral. Whereas somebody else might come back from that same culture and say, these people are horrible. We honor our dead by, burning their bodies and returning them to earth by scattering their ashes. These people, they just bury them in a box and then throw them and dig a hole and forget about them. That's so disrespectful. And what anthropologists, do is they point this stuff out all the time, right? They go, look, cultures are weird. We all believe sort of really different things. We have lots of different practices. And then the ethical relativist goes a step further and goes, oh, and therefore there's no right or wrong about any of this stuff. We're all just different, right? One of the claims their text wants to make is, look, there's a difference between these practices and then sort of general moral rules. And you think about, again, our culture that's burning the dead versus our culture that's burying the dead. Well, both of them are doing this because they respect their dead. And so they don't actually disagree at all. Even though on the surface, these cultures look radically different, they're really doing the same thing, right? Both of them deeply respect and honor their dead, and then they just have a different practice for doing it. What the critique here of ethical relativism is if you want to look cross-culturally at morality, you have to look at the theories, you have to look at the general principles that guide people's behaviors rather than the actual application of those principles, right? And if you start doing that, or text argues, you'll see that there's much less disagreement than there might appear to be on the surface. Different cultures have different rules for how to drive on the road, right? But the general principle, there should be rules that organize how we get traffic from one place to another. Well, that's universal, right? When we're talking about morality, we're talking about the universal. We're talking about these general rules and laws that govern how we behave. We're not talking about the specific applications typically, unless we're saying these deviate from the rules, and that's concerning. I skipped over one example here I want to talk a little bit more about. If you're an ethical relativist, right, then you believe morality is relative to culture, right? So what makes a moral claim true is that the cultural group believes it. Most people in the culture believe it, therefore it's true. Most people in the culture believe we should kick puppies for fun, therefore we ought to kick puppies for fun, right? There's ethical relativism. Challenge to that view. Cultures are not monolithic. Cultures diverge quite radically within them, right? And we might ask a question like, who in the culture has the authority to decide what is right or wrong? And what my culture is. If I'm a member of a little subgroup in that culture, and we think puppy kicking is wrong, why can't that be the relevant culture for my discussion? Why do I have to appeal back to the big group? And in fact, if the only thing that makes it right or wrong is just, well, the culture believes it, why not just go a step further and say, no, really, moral claims are just subjective. And really whatever I feel about morality is right for me. I have my truth, you have your truth, and there's nothing really more to say about it. I feel a certain way about puppy kicking, you might feel different. There's not a right or wrong, it's subjective, right? A lot of people say ethical relativism, when you sort of press it, that's what it degenerates into, is morality is really just a matter of opinion. There's no reason, there's no compelling reason to stop at, well, most people in the culture believe this, other than sort of you're just recording a statistical fact, but that's not interesting. Really what you should be saying is, well, individually, we all have our own feelings and opinions, and there's nothing more to it to say to that. It's just like, do you like ice cream, right? You feel a certain way about puppy kicking, I feel different. But we can't say anything else if we're subjectivist, because it's just subjective, it's just feeling, right? You might think, again, that's a mistake. That's not really how we talk about or think about or use morality. There's more we can say and should say. Finally, I want to talk about tolerance. When we think about morality, right? One of the most compelling reasons somebody might want to be an ethical relativist or an ethical subjectivist is because they think it leads to being more tolerant, right? And we hear this kind of language all the time. Your culture feels a certain way, my culture feels a certain way. We're different, and that's kind of cool. There's lots of diversity, but we should really be inclusive, and we should respect our differences, right? So I'll be tolerant of your worldview, you be tolerant of my worldview. Or you might say something like, look, I have my truth. This is my lived experience, and my truth tells me the world is a certain way, and that's legit. That's valid from my perspective. And you have your truth, and it might be radically different from mine, but there's nothing we can really say about that, because we're just talking about our own subjective realities and our own subjective experiences and opinions about morality, and there's nothing deeper you can say about that other than I have my truth, you have your truth. So let's be tolerant of one another, and let's learn and explore. Where does that tolerance come from? Where's that respect, right? That's an appeal to a universal principle that's culture independent or individual independent, right? Another way to take that same conversation, I have my truth, you have your truth, would be to say, look, I have my truth, you have your truth. I don't care about your truth. I have no reason to care about your truth, because your truth is just subjective to you. And my truth says to annihilate you, or to ignore you, or to exploit you, or to oppress you. And you have no legitimate grounds for denying or challenging my truth, because that's all there is to it, is just the subjective expression of our truths. So really, it should probably just be about power, maybe. If I have more power to force my truth on you, then you're just going to have to take it. There's nothing further to appeal to, right? Same thing with cultures. Why should I respect your culture? Or what if my culture doesn't respect cultures in general? It says, that's nice, you're tolerant. We're not. We're intolerant. And our truth is that we should annihilate you and oppress you and engage in treating you as our slaves. You might think, well, there's some sort of objective moral standard that justifies claims like tolerance. If we really want to be tolerant of others, if we think diversity and inclusion and respect for others and tolerance, all those kind of things are valuable and important, You get to them not by being a relativist about morality, not by thinking morality is relative to a culture, not by thinking morality is subjective to an individual, but by recognizing there's some universal general principles about the moral that apply to all of us, regardless of our subjective truths, regardless of our culture's opinions. And once you're there, then you're in the realm of a moral philosophy course, right? Then you think, look, well, morality is something, it's not merely a descriptive account of what groups of people believe. There's possibly some general rules that we can justify and maybe that are worth talking about. All right, have a good one.